Hi everyone, I'm Mel. Lovely to be here. That's a very tough act to follow, so I feel like, because I'm going to be talking a bit more screen-based, that it feels like very old school in what am I going to talk about. Let me just go through this. Which way first? Yeah, so hi, I'm Mel. I just thought I'd give a bit of background on me and then I'm going to talk about storytelling, probably not so much visual. And when I kind of was asked to speak, I was originally going to take a very philosophical view, and then I was realising kind of today that I might need to also make it a bit practical. So it'll jump a little bit between the more philosophical, and it started with me even going, before we even get into the algorithms and the data, the key question is, should we, not how do we? And that key question, and particularly when you're working with storytelling or visual media, if we're allowing kind of the algorithms to decide what's good, what does that do in terms of an unintended consequence of how we consume stories, narratives, behaviours and so forth, which I'll talk about. So I'm currently at Condé Nast. I've been there for a year. I actually have two roles. When I started, it was transformation lead. I've been there for a year and kind of came in to initially kind of help bring the New York and the UK offices together. So if you don't know Condé Nast, it's one of the largest media organisations in the world. I was going to get the data out because I am terrible at that, but it's Vogue, GQ, The New Yorker, Architectural Digest, Condé Nast Traveller. It's about 30 brands across the world. We're in about 33 markets, of which 13 of them we own, the rest are licensees. And we basically have a footprint. I don't know this very well. So on our video content on any given month, each month generates about 1 billion views. We reach about 84 million consumers in print, about 366 million in digital, and then about 384 on social platforms. So we have an incredibly large footprint across our brands. We're primarily a print organisation. That's where a lot of the revenue comes from. But we do increasingly diversify around Condé Nast Entertainment, which is now doing Netflix shows, and then all across our digital properties. So my job is actually twofold and comes from my background is design. But part of it's organisational design. Our technology teams are around 400 people. They're in 13 markets, so it's actually a lot of it is about how we work together. This talk is primarily a lot about that. And then stakeholder management. So I'm leading on a number of programs at the moment, which is the overall strategy for a brand on its digital footprint. The one I'm working on at the moment is Condé Nast Traveller. So what is the future of Condé Nast Traveller online, not so much in print, of which it is in 6 markets and has a footprint in multiple languages. So in terms of, the role that I take, it's not so much delivery anymore. So I'm not tied to actually getting and releasing code and getting it out there. It's ultimately the vision and actually the experience that we need to create to then deliver to the consumer. So my primary job is actually stakeholder management and getting people to believe before we start. Probably the best way to describe it. So yeah, there's a bit of a slide. So, and even when I start, even my head just gets blown away by the kind of, not only the footprint, but actually on a day-to-day basis. I can be dealing with anybody in New York, in London, in Spain. I can be in any of our 2 offices. So it's a bit of a mind meld even as a person, just trying to bring together and deliver at scale, because we have about 24 technology teams that are actually releasing code on a daily basis. But my background is slightly weird in a product world because I come from a background of creativity. So I'm a photographer by background, which is why I wanted to do a philosophical conversation. This was not about data. I was looking at the human part, not the machine. And often when we work and we talk, we often forget the story that needs to be told to actually get all of us in the room aligned to a belief of a thing that we need to create that does not yet exist. Right? And certainly when I started at Condé Nast, we basically went from a commercial spreadsheet that said, deliver this, we need to save money or make money, into cutting code and then wondering why it didn't work. Because that messy middle, and our design teams are tiny, that messy middle didn't exist. So unsurprisingly, it doesn't work. And if you actually look at some of our properties, you'll get, I know it's screen-based and a bit boring, but 40 calls to action, right? Whether it's a sign-up, a registration, a paywall, just to read an article is really hard. And my background is creativity, it's telling stories, it's taking pictures when there are no words, but also I'm a traveller, and so I'll talk a little bit about that because I'm massively passionate about serendipity, right? And the idea that disconnected ideas can come together, but also that you don't have to plan for everything. And I work in a product world where everything has to be planned, it has to be data-driven, it has to be decided from the data, we have to do a roadmap, we need to know the outcome, and I go, stop. right? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to do? So my kind of nomadic background, sort of living on the road, is kind of great, but it also informs how I work, how I coach teams, how I build teams around a framework and a structure, but ultimately to create alignment. So I've broken this story down into 3 parts. So we're going to talk about storytelling, the algorithm, and then making decisions. Hopefully they will weave together. It's the first time I've tried to put these 3 things together. And I've got some videos to show as well that hopefully will work. So I'm not going to talk about sort of creating products. So from my photographic background, and apply the word story to this, it's all about seeing, it's all about interpretation, it's all about how we feel about something when we look at it. And that's why Condé Nast as a brand, as a company to work for is incredible, because everything we do is about the story. And Dita Pepper is actually one of my favourite photographers. And one of the reasons why, she's a Czech photographer, has been working for a number of years. I don't know her personally, but when I saw this work, not this work, the one I'm about to show you, it just kind of blew my mind in terms of the power of the image. Oops. So she did a project as part of her master's and thesis, which was to imagine her life based on the person she married, right? So she actually found these people on the street. So she was in wherever she was, and she asked them if they would participate in a project with her to imagine what her life would be based on the person that she met. And through that, it's creating a kind of performance and a narrative. And for me, what it shows very clearly is that, you know, our perception of our identity can change instantly, right? Our perception of how we view that person, are they rich? Are they poor? Are they, do they have money, right? You instantly have made an assessment based on that image. Right? But it's the same woman. Yep. Some of the people she didn't know, they're not her children. So this is a made-up story. These are made-up families, but she goes from everything from a gypsy Roma person to I would interpret, you know, a proper Slavic, Russian, Czech, you know, rich woman, you know, living on the streets, you know, being married and young, same age, same time, etc. And the power of the image, and this is why when I talk about should we, before we do how do we, is what are the things that we tell to our consumers, our customers, our audience, or etc. if we allow an algorithm to decide this for us, right? Because in the world of media and in the world of advertising, in the world of travel, the algorithm is an interface before we get to a decision, particularly on the web. And my question has always been, should it, right? Because it has had very significant unintended, whether it's news, media, politics or not, right? It is providing a lens of what good looks like or what we should think and what we should believe. And the ethics of that was never tested, or it was never discussed. So at least, you know, in the robotic, there's work being done, probably as an unintended consequence of what's been happening in our more generalist media, not impact. You could actually argue it's low impact, but it's not. It's changed how we view cultures, it's changed how we travel, and it's changed how we behave. So crafting a story is a way of seeing that ultimately I don't believe a computer should determine, right? The beauty of humanity is the diversity of our cultures and of our languages. It's even a challenge actually Condé Nast in terms of how we work. If we are just a predominantly Anglo-English, UK, US-based company, right, and we do not absorb the awesomeness of our Asian partners and of our Middle Eastern partners and our Spanish partners or any of the people that we work for, we create generic experiences, which to some extent we do, right? Going through the flavour of action. If you actually look at the mags, the magazines are brilliant. My favourite at the moment is GQ Portugal, because the essence of the Portuguese mag, it's like contemporary and it's hardcore and it's really interesting. And we do work, particularly on the Vogue titles, to make sure we have that local expertise, but some of our websites aren't doing that at the moment. Everything's standardised, the templates are standardised. For us to be efficient as technologists and engineers, everything is standardised. It's a bit of a gap. So this is part, I'm going to put it now into context of a role and a practicality of how I talk about with the teams in the kind of design and UX, is that if you want people to align, you need to tell them a story. Sorry, I'm going to jump. Sorry, breathe. And part of that is, particularly in a product and a UX world, I've seen many spreadsheets, this practical stuff, where we've jumped through at a meeting today, right, where we're jumping from a brief that's been written into implementation. I'm like, can we just slow down, please? We don't know why. We don't know for whom. This is really basic stuff, but it's interesting in the world of product and UX that it's kind of disappeared, right? I have really just surprised the stuff we were doing 10 years ago isn't really what's happening today. And I use the word, and people even, some of the people I work with go, what is experience strategy? So maybe I'm preaching to the converted, but it's interesting how you still have to go back to the basics. So this is the story I tell at work, to define the difference between a product strategy and an experience strategy. So let's say you're going to go to a wedding, right? And we're going to have a wedding. I'm going to get married, and I'm really excited about my wedding, but the first thing I have to do is imagine it. It does not yet exist. Right? And there's nothing wrong with spending the time to imagine that world. That wedding, this one, I want a really hippie wedding. I want it in a barn. I want 20 people to come. I want 50 people to come. I want the photographer to be a friend. These are decisions that I am making across an overall end-to-end vision and of all the things that I need to create. So I have to imagine that vision before I start deciding how to build it, how to make it, and how to deliver it. Maybe I'm talking about the obvious, but it is really interesting because it's a skill we're not taught in UX, I don't think, not probably to the extent that you're taught at art school. You're taught about the unknown, you're taught about the messy middle, and you're taught to start with a blank canvas. I know engineers can find that really difficult. Some UX people find it very difficult, but actually hiring teams or people that can do that is really important. Because I could also have a very formal wedding, right? I could have a wedding that needs 400 people in a church, in a synagogue, in a temple. I need to spend 3 weeks. It's a 3-day fiesta. It goes on. There are rituals that occur. That's the experience strategy that I'm trying to create. The mechanics of how we deliver, both things are actually the same, right? Once I get to my product strategy and my roadmap, that is the implementation of it. Each one of the pillars is actually the same. They don't change. So whether I need a photographer, the food, the venue, doesn't matter whether I'm having the hippie wedding or the big wedding, just the scale of it changes. And it doesn't matter whether I'm doing a single brand in the US or a brand across 15 markets. The mechanics of how I deliver it are ultimately the same, but the vision I'm trying to create is very different. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is actually that stakeholder management to get people to align. And a lot of the work we're going to be introducing is that storytelling component, right? And building that into the UX, the design process with the engineers so that I can have everyone from the editor-in-chief all the way down to the engineer believing the same story. Because if you believe the same story, then you're going to work really hard to deliver it. And the biggest question that I get at the moment from the teams is, what's our vision? And it's very, a vision isn't a mission statement. It is not a business canvas. It is not anything. That is the outcome of something you can imagine. So I was going to play a video, and I won't play all of it, and hopefully it will work.
You have 3 messages. Your graduate research team in Guatemala, just checking in. Robert Jordan, a second semester junior, requesting a second extension on his term paper. And your mother reminding you about your father.
Surprise birthday party next Sunday.
Today you have a faculty lunch at 12 o'clock. You need to take Kathy to the airport by 2. You have a lecture at 4:15 on deforestation in the Amazon rainforest.
Right. Let me see the lecture notes from last semester. No, that's not enough. I need to review more recent literature. Pull up all the new articles I haven't read yet.
Journal articles only?
Fine.
Your friend Jill Gilbert has published an article about deforestation in the Amazon and its effects on rainfall in the sub-Sahara. It also covers drought's effect on food production in Africa and increasing imports of food.
Contact Jill.
I'm sorry, she's not available right now. I left a message that you had called.
Okay. Let's see. There's an article about 5 years ago, Dr. Flemson or something. He really disagreed with the direction of Jill's research.
John Fleming of Uppsala University. He published in the Journal of Earth Science of July 20 of 2006.
I'll stop it there. Has anyone seen it before? Yeah. Let me go back. I discovered this when I was trying to explain some stuff at Condé about how to tell stories. So it was made in 1987 by Apple, and it was a 20-year vision on what the future of kind of technology could be. None of the technologies existed at the time that they were created. So if you think about 1987, that is before I had email. That is before, you know, the internet was truly working. When you watch it, it's actually semi-terrifying in the sense of it basically predicts where the world that we live in today. So that effectively Skype or any kind of video conferencing, it has all the interactions of the things that we do, and ultimately it talks about the climate crisis that we're currently going through, which was part of their story. Now, I know, so I learned this from an advertising world. I'm sure there's many agency people here. But it's incredible how, and I wouldn't never imagine doing a 20-year vision. But what was really interesting about this, and when you look into the research, what it did was it was enable the engineers and the commercial people and whatever to actually work out how that technology was built. To no extent, even if we're doing robotics, etc. today, those sort of techniques still apply. But they're not always used. So it's kind of was a thing around for me about like the element of storytelling, which is a very design and creative craft, is very important in the product design process or product development process. And taking that approach. So in the more practical kind of data-driven and coming from a visual background, if you're a designer, you know, I would advocate for anybody, if you wanted to do a course, do one on photography, you know, do one on literally how you have to tell stories without words and how you have to edit without words. Because the point of any kind of image is that you don't need words to explain things. So from the artist that we saw before, you could already make assumptions of what's going on. Because our ability, regardless of what language we speak, of what culture we come from, the translation of that is less than instant. So our ability to make impressions, make decisions, and move forward on anything that we're trying to do is extrapolated if the design that you create is visual. And we're living in a visual world. Everything's talking about video and everything's talking about photography. So if you're working in this world, this isn't about the buttons, the colours, the order and the structure, right, and the box with the cross in it, in the old days of the screen world. It's actually about what's inside the box that really, really matters. Because our brain processes it faster, and our attention span is probably even less than that now, significantly smaller. You think about your own behaviour and how much you're flicking through websites and making decisions and stuff that you do on Google, whether it's maps or otherwise. And companies that invest in their visual content, right, in terms of their rights management, their production, and unfortunately for a lot of photographers, they're not paid very well anymore. And everyone's a photographer, everyone can create content, but actually doing it really well is quite hard. Harder than you actually think. Someone like me took 10 years out of it and came back. Actually relearning the craft is kind of hard, not hard, but it's a learning curve. Let's go through. And in that last part of the storytelling part, before I go through, words are literal. So this is, I saw a fantastic talk a couple of years ago by the guy that built Giphy, right? And when I say I love you in a text, yeah, I could mean all kinds. I love you as a friend, I love you as a parent, I love my pets, I love my parents, and I have my lover. So just saying I love you isn't enough. And if you think also about the technologies we use, or even photographs that we take, we don't write notes anymore. We're taking photos to remember the things that we're learning. We are sending images to each other when we're going somewhere. Can't find someone, take a photo and send it to them. Want to know where you are, take a photo and send them. So actually our conversation has become visual as much as the way that we communicate in a product context. Go forward, they all go, yeah, there we go. Part one. So part two was the algorithm. And in terms of what the algorithm does for us. Now, I'm not an algorithmic expert. I dip in and out. So if I get anything wrong and you are, I apologise. But the thing that I find really challenging, having worked with some machine learning designers, particularly when I worked at Photobox, which was very much about photographic machine learning, was it was all about teaching the machine to see, to teach the machine to feel, to give it all the parameters, right? But the parameters we were always giving were rational, right? So I can go through an image, and this is what a lot of photographic machine learning does, right? And it basically brings everything down to the abstraction of objects, the abstraction of things. So you know what the object is, it can learn who the person is, it can make assessments on what the person is. But what is a photograph to a machine when it can have different meanings? My cultural impact will determine how I'll interpret it. My background, my current emotions will have a... So how do you feed the machine that? Oops. Oh. Because we ultimately come down to very descriptive views of photography and narrative and storytelling. And when we're doing things like in my world, syndication, what's the most popular? What's the thing that's going to bubble to the top? It's the algorithm that's deciding that based on frequency, based on how many clicks we get. And okay, it's really boring ad tech from some perspective. And we often forget as a creative to look outside those data points. So a very dangerous part at the moment of data-driven design is stepping away from the data. We're so paranoid about stepping away from the data or putting multiple data points together. So again, with my teams, I go, you cannot put one data point in front of me and say that that's kind of the be-all and end-all and why we have to make a decision. You need to weave the story together with multiple data points. And I'll explain why in a second. But ultimately, you know, as we go through, that's why I started with a philosophical question. Should we be allowing machines to determine what is good in a world of where image making is how we translate the world increasingly, both in our online world and our real world, right? Think about the problems we have with fake news. Think about the information as it's streamed. This is because the algorithm is determined by popularity in a ranking system, dating, all those algorithms that are impacting our human lives based on how we date, where we go, where we eat, what we drink and what we do, it is an algorithm that is telling us that. So have you ever not actually, which is the next bit, not used an algorithm? So the last part, the decision making. And this is where it gets interesting and the travel story comes into play. So how we experience the world today. Because if our images are a way of experiencing something, it's a way of sharing something, it's also a sense of participation. What happens when it becomes generic? So I'm going to use this photo. It's not a real photo. When was the last... I don't know, this is more a broader question. I'm not asking for a specific answer. But when I go travelling at the moment, it makes me really sad. Because when I used to travel, I used to have no plans. I'd have a guidebook, The Lovely Lonely Planet. But my ultimate goal was when I hit a destination, I would orientate myself and I would put that book down and I would explore with no desire to tick off the list of the things to do, with no, just to feel a city. And I still do that. I was in Japan a couple of weeks ago, and once we orientated ourselves, I don't do the 10 top things to do. I will never use TripAdvisor, because ultimately when I do, wherever I go, there's a queue, right? So it does not matter whether it's the top restaurant, right? Whether it's the big thing that I need to do. We have lost that essence of discovering for the fear that we will miss something important, when actually the thing that you are missing is the thing you don't know, right? And in terms of these algorithms, particularly in travel, not only is it frustrating because you stand for a queue, it also is telling the rest of the world to be the same. I do not want to go, which I was seriously in Kyoto, where there was a queue out the door, just like this, for a cool bar. And I went, it's all full of foreigners and tourists, or foreigners and tourists, so foreigners, because you can tell a foreigner in Japan very easily. And what it was a speakeasy bar run by a French guy, making cocktails that I can get around the corner. I can live in London, in New York, London, Paris, Barcelona. Why is that popular in Japan? Because actually Japan was more amazing when you found the sake bar with a few expats, a couple of Japanese, you know, and you're sitting there singing karaoke in a very lost in translation moment. And yet, if I was to try and explain to that group, seriously guys, just stop following the rule book of TripAdvisor or the best of lists, because those things rank. Right, that's the whole point. The algorithm is saying this is the best thing to do in Tokyo, Paris, etc. It is not as a traveller. And I think as we over-rely on these things, that's the question of why should we. So as a traveller, please, next time you go to any destination, go for a walk, right? Put down that phone. I mean, I still use the phone all day, every day. But once we got into the rhythm of Japan, my God, there are experiences that most of my friends say, how did you have that? And I said, because I talked to the person next to me. I had a conversation. And in a model of my memory, I wouldn't do that. I'm too frightened. They scare me. I might get robbed. This might happen because the data's telling me, and on and on. But the point of the kind of decision making is that we have to trust our humanity a little bit more. We have to trust the intuition, the 20 years of experience in design that says this won't work. I don't need data to prove it. I will have data to support it, and I will eat my words if I'm wrong, but I will also trust my intuition about how I'm going to design something. We need to bring that back into the process. Particularly interestingly, we talk about it a little bit at Condé, and it was actually the director of product in the US, as I was trying to, he was like, right, you're dealing with lots of very influential people that you work with, you know. Anyone from Anna Wintour down to Melinda, who's the editor-in-chief, and everyone else in between. So everyone has an opinion. And the thing about Condé, if you want their trust and their belief in you, you don't go in and tell them what to do. That's the first thing. You don't tell them about the data. You've got to understand that in product management, yes, we have to do product, we have to harmonise, we have to standardise, we have to turn off tech, but you have to trust their intuition. Because the reason that they're the editor of Vogue, the reason that Eddie or whoever it is they can spot the trend. They don't need data to tell them. They're really good ones. That's the whole point, right? They're very good at what they do because they're using the data. Trust me, they are. But they're also using their heart and they believe in what they do. So I think I was going to show one last story and then we're going to have some questions because it's 10 minutes. This was the last one. This was actually an ad campaign, which I thought was another interesting way of explaining the beauty of nuance, which I would really advocate. Have anyone seen this? Okay, I don't have to show it. We can go straight into questions. Why this was an interesting kind of campaign, it was done by Sony in Australia. And what they did was they got 6 photographers to come in and shoot this person. And what they did in the briefing session is they gave that person an identity. It is an actor. Right, so the actor knew what was going on. And basically what happened was the photographer was coming in and was told to shoot this person in the context of that sort of role that they had. A convict, a fisherman, a lifesaver, alcoholic, millionaire and a psychic. Right? They didn't know that this was an experiment. And what they were trying to show was that the role of creativity, but also the role of how the photographer actually layers identity onto the image itself. So it's not about just the identity of the end of the subject, the interpretation of the photographer, which is both challenging because it also puts in stereotypes and cliches, etc., but also the nuance of the flavour of the work. What happened was, same studio, same lighting, same everything. They photographed the person fundamentally different ways and layered on bias 100%. So that's the negative of not having. That's why people argue with data. You remove the bias. Well, no, you don't. You just layer more the single bias into the system, not multiple. But at least this can create a conversation and a narrative by which you can discuss. It was absolutely fascinating. Like if the millionaire is shot really bright, really light, really centre, really strong, really heroic. The ex-convict is shot in the dark, you know, shot towards the window. He's small in the framing, a little bit more. I mean, both are intimidating, but in very different perspectives. But you want to make them relaxing. Get him to smile. Look, he's a lifesaver. The lighting between the two are very similar, right? But then it's the interaction with the photographer who then gets the subject to look and feel a certain way. And as a question, do we actually think an algorithm could do that? There's loads of technology by Google that will tell you that they can design, which they can, a landscape that is better. But then I go, but it's not by Ansel Adams. You know, it's not by, you know, this human that's kind of created a story that creates a conversation. And that is basically it. So kind of the takeaway, you have to take away the word of the camera. But actually to kind of have a role of the future, right? If you are ignorant of the image and of the way that it works, right? Those that have the power of this will have the power of the future. And you can see it in some of the, a whole nother topic, but in news and in politics today. If you own the story, piece of feedback that I got even in leadership, if you own the story, you own your narrative. And if you own your narrative, you can control how you're perceived. So I don't think I would want a computer controlling that. That's it.